next speaker has really dedicated his career to looking into the effects of climate, the effects of global impacts of our actions and so forth. So Seth Schultz serves as Special Advisor on Science and Innovation to the Global Covenant of Mayors, something that I recently learned about. Very impressive organization across the world. You'll hear more about that. Interestingly enough, he's the lead author of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, and it's really focused on the 1.5 degree temperature raise that will result in many impacts across the globe. And again, I had the opportunity to have dinner last night and have some conversations. He's very much involved in both the green building and living building movements, having been right at the ground floor, so to speak, of some of these. So the tie-in today with our living building was a nice surprise. And he's very generous with his time and expertise. He's an expert in hazardous materials. He was a responder at 9/11 to help sort out all the situation there, especially with regard to hazardous materials, and as well as in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. So we're thrilled to have Seth here today to take some precious time from his schedule and share with us his thoughts. Seth?
Thank you. Well, it is great to be back here, but first I just wanted another quick round of applause for Amy. Yeah, really amazing presentation. And I'm going to come onto it in a little bit in my presentation, but in general, low-lying island nations have played a humongous role in the last decade in climate change, punching far above their weight, and I'll come into that. So everything you're doing, it's amazing to hear a U.S. ambassador getting on stage and talk about climate change. So I really appreciate that. But I also appreciate the opportunity to be back at Binghamton. Binghamton is a special place for me. I think Amy summed up a lot of things really well, but I too had some of my best friendships were forged here, but even more importantly, on the very first day of school at Binghamton as an undergrad, I met my wife Adrienne here in CIW on the volleyball court. And it turned out, actually, we lived in the same dorm building, a floor apart. She's in the back with my 3 kids, Ian, Owen, and Eleanor. Yeah. So, but Binghamton also, I actually worked as a student here in the Environmental Health and Safety Department. And a guy there by the name of Jerry Gordon took me under his wing. I was bulking solvents and chemicals in the chemistry labs, but he really took me under his wing, gave me some accreditation and certification basically as an undergrad, which was really special and helped actually propel me into my career. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because I've had a very unusual career, very fortunate career. But it started off in the first decade or so working with large consultancy firms and engineering firms. And it was really interesting because as a result, in working with hazardous materials and emergency response, I actually got to see how cities are built from the inside out, the complex jungle of infrastructure and policy. And it's a really eye-opening experience. But over that time, as you just heard, I had the good fortune to work on some really massive response projects, both 9/11, Hurricane Katrina as a few. And those had a huge impact on me. And I started getting really frustrated about having to be on the reactive side of these issues and these problems and these disasters and wanted to get on the preventative side if I could. And that led me through a really interesting journey through the U.S. Green Building Council, through the Clinton Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies. And in that journey of what we were trying to do and how we were trying to tackle it is, how can we address this global commons issue of climate change, but in a way that's very personal, that's where we live, and that's on the ground? And as a result of that, we started coming up with this idea and this notion of cities as change agents, and cities with the ability to implement at a faster scale than the negotiations that were being stalled over the last 30 years of national governments. And as a result, we saw cities come to the forefront in terms of their ambition, but also the action in terms of addressing this issue. So about 12 years ago, we created an organization called C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And you might ask, well, why cities? You know, out of all the issues we have to address and try to solve, why cities? Well, cities are the confluence of where things happen. It's where society becomes durable. It's where the future happens first in terms of a mixing of cultures, in terms of innovation, in terms of economic development. But it's also where there's a concentration of people. So if there's impacts associated with climate change, and there's a lot of people living in one place, they're impacted the most. It's also where you have density of infrastructure. So there's more cost and economic loss. So as a result, kind of think about cities as canaries in a coal mine. They're on the first or front lines of this issue, and they've been dealing with it. So for a decade, cities have not been debating whether climate change exists or not. They've been dealing with the consequences. When we surveyed cities for the first time about this, maybe about 8 years ago, and we asked them, we had a response rate that 98% of them believed in climate change. It's 98% because one city missed the question. But cities are also a big part of the problem. Cities consume 70% of the world's energy, and as a result are a huge equation of where the greenhouse gas emissions that are getting emitted. But cities are also able to implement things on the ground. And I get a lot of questions about this, but another way to think about it, it's not that mayors out across the world are huge climate champions and advocates. No, I like to refer to mayors as the world's greatest pragmatists, because they have to run a city. They don't have time to debate or to discuss. They have to take out the garbage. They have to make sure that the trains are running on time. They have to make sure that you have schools that are good for your children and that you've got breathable air. So as a result of this, mayors are on the forefront of just tackling these issues in a way, I think, that has moved the agenda forward in a really incredible way, especially in the context of the lack or the failure of national governments to come together around consensus on climate change. But that all changed. That all changed when we had the Paris Agreement 2 years ago. And national governments did come together in a historic moment, 197 countries, and they agreed to tackle this issue. And I'm going to come into that a little bit, because what they agreed to is to hold global warming to 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise from pre-industrial level with an ambition to do more. And that's where that 1.5 degrees come in, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But before we get into that, this is where cities came hurtling forward to the forefront of this discussion. Because as we're running out of time and as action needs to get taken, cities, you can see on this map here, cities are a huge driver of this. This is just 96 of the world's largest cities here. And those 96 cities represent 25% of the world's gross domestic product. These 96 cities also represent 700 million people. So when we get these cities to collectively take action, it moves the needle. It moves the needle globally, politically, etc. So that's why we're focusing on this, because of the power with which that they can implement things, and implement things quite quickly. So how do they do that? When I say quickly, what does that mean? So the idea of the network is quite interesting. Mayors get into office by their successes, and if they're successful enough, they can get reelected again. So mayors and cities aren't in the business of telling or talking about their failures. But sometimes the failures are much more important than successes, because you can avoid your mistakes and not replicate them. So what we do in a network model is we help cities share with each other about what their successes were, but more importantly, what their failures were. And as a result, we're able to leapfrog development and policy implementation. One simple example, back in 2011, 6 cities in C40 were doing bike sharing programs. 2 years later, in 2013, 36 cities had bike sharing programs. That was a 500% increase in action in a 2-year time frame. Policy doesn't happen in that time frame. What was happening is that cities were literally opening up their playbooks to each other. This is the bike manufacturer, this is the finance mechanism, this is how we were connecting different modes of transportation into the city and the outer city. As a result, you saw that explosion or increase in action. What's also special about C40 is that it's not an NGO telling mayors what to do. It was founded by mayors and run by mayors. So they actually manage the organization and give the direction to us about what we need to do. Quite unique and quite special. And then lastly, when the Paris Agreement happened, it was a big change for us 2 years ago, and we started saying, how do we take science and drive it into policy making, which is what I'm going to spend some time talking about now. So, well, we started crunching the numbers. And the AR5, the annual assessment cycles that the IPCC goes through, we use the AR5 information and data, and basically there's a carbon budget left. The carbon budget is basically 400 gigatons. And we started kind of downscaling that based on population. What we ended up with, based on the 700 or so million people living in C40 cities, there's a 22 gigaton budget associated with those people in those cities. And as a result, it's just think about it kind of like a bank. You've got certain money in the bank that you can spend. You've got credits and debits, right? Our sponsors, M&T's nodding. You can break it down into a pretty straightforward process that way. And when we did that, we saw some pretty staggering things emerge. If C40 cities, again, these are just 100 of the world's largest cities, right? if those cities can continue developing and growing in a business as usual way without changing anything, they would consume their portion of the world's carbon budget, that 22 gigatons, by 2025. Think about that. Even more shocking, what we saw, is that left unchecked, those 100 largest cities in the world would consume the entire world's remaining carbon budget by 2050, in terms of a 1.5 degree scenario. This was pretty shocking stuff. And as a result, we saw and were able to backscale, to kind of backtrack and downscale what needs to happen and when. You hear a lot of people talking about carbon neutral societies, mid-century, et cetera, et cetera. But if you back that up in terms of an implementation and policy framework, it actually has to happen now. We have to start doing this right now. So 5 tons have to go to 3 tons per person on average by 2030, and we have to have a carbon neutral society more by like 2050 if we want to hold to 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees is important. This is where the High Ambition Coalition comes in, these low-lying island nations, because the world agreed to hold to 2 degrees. But at 2 degrees, many countries around the world cease to exist due to sea level rise, even associated with 2 degrees of warming. So 1.5 is quite important depending on where you're at. And also, when you remember, when we talk about these numbers, the 1.5 or 2 degrees, that's an average of what the temperature is on the surface of the Earth, meaning some places are much hotter than that and others are colder. So we're talking about 1.5 or 2. There's places like sub-Saharan Africa that are already dealing with 2 degrees of warming. So there is some good news, though, because as we started implementing this plan on 1.5 and looking at what is possible and how can they do it, we had an unbelievably courageous political position that C40 took in their mayors. This is 2 years ago. They unanimously passed that as a condition of membership in this organization, they had to adopt a 1.5 degree scenario, and they had to create a plan with which to mitigate and adapt to a 1.5 degree scenario and pass it through city legislation. Unbelievable. And in less than 2 years, we now have 67 cities that have signed up for that in just 2 years. So there's an incredible amount of movement. But more exciting, our analysis showed that if every city in the world, over 250,000 people, were to do the same, it would result in 40% of the emissions reductions in the world required to hold to 1.5. That's a big number. So when you keep hearing about this, the impacts, and it is pretty scary and how transformative it is, there is some good news here. There are vehicles, there are systems, there are actors that can make a huge difference, and cities is one of them. And also, I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of the dauntingness of this. And we talk about transformation. There's going to be people that, winners and losers associated with that. There's people that are benefit, there's people that are going to get hurt from that. And a lot of the work going on right now is trying to understand what that is and to try to get ready for that and to transition societies and economies so there's less impact of that. We talk about equity, we talk about social justice. These are huge components. But what's more important to recognize or to dwell on for a moment is the cost and the impact if we don't do anything. If we don't do anything, the problems are far more severe. So just as a quick example, the UN has a report that came out that there's an expected 200 million climate refugees that are expected in 2030. That's in 14 years if we don't do something. 1.3 billion at risk by mid-century. But also associated with doing this, again sounding daunting, there is huge opportunity in this transformation and this shift. We're already seeing what's happening in terms of renewable energy, in terms of wind and energy. It's creating far more jobs in the fossil fuel industry right now. That's just one simple example. As we talk about automated, autonomous, and electric vehicles, that's having very disruptive impacts in cities, but also creating huge opportunities moving forward in terms of jobs in the economy. But as we look at how we integrate both adaptation and mitigation, avoid issues of maladaptation, as we divest from one thing and invest it into another, these are all issues that present risks, but very, very large opportunities. And there's an opportunity to piggyback on these. We call this co-benefits. And shifting the conversation away from just one of climate change and gases that you can't see to things that are tangible and understandable is really important. And this is where we're seeing a lot of traction around the world. So as we go around and talking to mayors, again, it's not as if climate change is the first thing on a mayor's list of priorities. Usually they got, hired into office, elected into office to create safer streets or to improve their education system. So what we've done is we've helped kind of add up and assess the positive influence associated with climate change with the day-to-day operations of a city. Here's just a couple of quick examples. So we looked at what was happening in Mexico City. Mexico City has had some of the worst air quality in the world for decades. It's a massive issue. They've done all kinds of things like limiting the number of days you can drive your vehicle, odd and even numbered license plates, et cetera, et cetera. Big, big, big issue, politically, health-wise. So they've been doing a lot of investment in what we call non-motorized transit, walking and cycling. And this is the idea that the last century or so we've gotten our urban form wrong. It's not, cities aren't built for cars, they're built for people. We need to make them walkable and habitable for a human landscape and a human experience. So Mexico City is really been all on this file, working very hard on it, and they've pedestrianized one of the most famous streets in Mexico City. But when they did that, what they saw along that street is that their business, you know, the money that the shops on those streets, the businesses had an increase of 70% of revenue in a 12-month period. They had savings of $65 million from the transportation department alone. So when you look at the different benefits, so you don't have to talk about this in terms of climate change, you can talk about it in terms of walkability, street safety, and business opportunities in the city, as one small example. You see others up here. There's some on air quality. New York City did a ton of work on air quality and tackling climate change through these issues of air quality. Infrastructure, managing stormwater through proper infrastructure, saves $1.5 billion in New York City alone. So as we start understanding that tackling climate change is actually good for society, actually good for the economy, actually good for health, all of a sudden, we don't have to single it out as the single most important issue. It is the common thread that pulls all of these things together. And that's where we're seeing this massive mobilization around the world in cities doing this. I'm now working with an organization called the Global Covenant of Mayors, and that's a network of all these networks. There are over 9,000 cities in the world now committed to addressing the Paris Agreement through local action on the ground. So I want to leave you with that positive message that there is a lot happening. There is a lot of people that are aware of this, and everybody here, living wherever you live in your community, can also be a part of it. Thank you.